In Russia, in the spring of 2015, flatbed train wagons were spotted carrying unfamiliar armored vehicles. The turrets were carefully wrapped in tarpaulin, clearly intended to prevent a casual observer from gaining much information about the vehicles. On the 9th of May 2015, at Russia's annual Victory Day parade, celebrating the defeat of Nazi Germany in May 1945, the tarpaulin came off, and a handful of these vehicles made their first public appearance. It was a brand new tank system, designated the T-14 Armata, or Weapon Main Battle Tank. It was not an impressive debut. One of the tanks broke down on the parade route and was stranded for 15 minutes until hasty repairs could be made, and it was again able to move off under its own power. But the appearance of the tank caused suppressed ripples of excitement and concern in equal measures amongst Western intelligence communities. What details could be seen suggested a revolutionary new design. The tank commander, braced smartly as he delivered a crisp salute to the watching Russian dignitaries, was not in the turret, but rather in the forward part of the hull. The turret appeared to be uncrewed. The Russian government announced that trials would soon start, and then production would begin. There was talk of producing 120 per year, and that an ultimate production line of 2,300 tanks would replace and upgrade the entire active Russian tank fleet. A, quote, family of Armata vehicles was to include an infantry fighting vehicle, an armored recovery vehicle, and a self-propelled artillery version. This would be a very big deal. But the best part of a decade later, and the T-14 still does not appear to have been produced in any significant numbers. It has not seen any active service, and indeed, its entire future is shrouded in mystery. After the initial fanfare and attention, the T-14s become something of a laughingstock amongst military analysts. In late 2023, many analysts were convinced that the T-14 will never work as a fully produced operational combat vehicle. So what is the T-14? What happened to it and where is it now? And is it any good? Let's take a look at the T-14 Armata. Russian tank design achieved legendary status during the Second World War. You will almost certainly have heard of the T-34, which is still judged to be one of the best tanks of World War II. Its sloped armor, wide tracks, and powerful for the time 76mm gun came as a great shock to the German panzer formations that thrust into Russia during the Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. Other Russian tank designs such as the KV-1, the T-34-85, and the Joseph Stalin sent the Germans scrambling for their tank design drawing boards. During the Cold War, Russian tanks continued to evolve. The T-54-55 series, the T-64 and 72 models, and later the T-80 and T-90. Russian policy was to keep the tanks low to the ground, hard-hitting with a powerful main armament, and available in large numbers. They were rarely as technologically advanced as NATO tanks, but they were largely respected by NATO and Western armies, particularly given the well-understood principle that these tanks would generally be used in massed formations. But it's worth noting that, scratching the surface, the Russian tank industry has always been fractured by rivalries between tank factories, competing designers, corruption, and struggles for attention and resources of the government. Some analysts have looked at the T-64, T-72, and T-80 and concluded that this was an illogical and highly uneconomic production of three versions of what was more or less the same tank. What seems clear is that the Russian military never seems to have managed to settle on one tank type and one family of vehicles. It also looked as if the Russian tank industry was still living off its old glory days without the resources to invest in a new tank suitable for the 2020s and beyond. Perhaps because of these deep-seated historical challenges, Russian tank design has preferred to focus on upgrading existing tank models with new technology, armor, and protective systems, rather than develop a new tank. And the Russians never like to throw any old tanks away. They store them in huge tank parks east of the Ural Mountains for a time when they might be needed. A time such as now. You'll see more or less every Cold War and post-Cold War variety of Russian tank on the battlefields of Ukraine. When a prototype tank design, the T-95, was cancelled in 2010, the Russian tank-producing industrial complex of Uralvagonzavod began working on a new model. It was initially called Object 148. This was to become the T-14 Armata, but it doesn't seem to have been actually based on the previous T-95 work, but rather around a new engine type, the A-85-3, a Russian copy of a German model. This engine was used instead of the classic tank engine that had kitted out the T-72s and T-90s. The reason for that is unclear. The A-85-3 was smaller but more powerful, but it also turned out to be more complex and less reliable, and it had not even been originally designed for a tank. After the T-14's somewhat embarrassing debut at the 2015 Victory Day Parade, the Western intelligence community started to put their heads together to see what this new development was all about. The information that began to trickle in was, from a Western perspective, very troubling. Given that there is little confirmed or confirmable information about the T-14, we'll have to rely a little heavily on the Russian defense industry brochures and state press statements. This is obviously not ideal, given the high likelihood of propaganda, but let's dive in anyway. So at least we can get a sense of the sort of expectations, hype, and anticipation surrounding this new weapon system. The concept certainly looked highly unique. The turret was to be automated and remote controlled. The three-man crew would sit side by side in a special protected and sealed crew compartment in the front hull of the vehicle. There would even be a toilet provided for the crew, a radical concession to comfort from the tank designers. The tank's main armament was originally intended to have been a 152mm weapon. This was what the earlier T-95 concept was supposed to have mounted, but it was later identified as a 125mm gun that would also be able to fire anti-tank missiles. It would have a 57mm grenade launcher and a 12.7mm heavy machine gun automatically operated in the unmanned turret. Average speed on the road was given as 80 km per hour. The 7 road wheels either side were connected to an active suspension system that would give a smoother ride and provide more effective fire control while on the move. There was talk that the main gun would be able to shoot down low-flying helicopters. A system of video cameras would be fitted on all sides, and the commander's vision system would be mounted on the turret to allow 360-degree visibility. The crew were supported by a highly responsive combat management computer system that could rapidly analyze the battlefield environment, identify potential threats and targets, and automatically take measures to protect the tank via an Afghanit Active Protection System, or APS. They should be able to detect tank-sized objects at over 7 kilometers in the daytime and half that distance at night. A radar would identify incoming missiles. A new generation of highly secretive Malachite explosive reactive armor had also been promised. This would surround the tank with advanced protective layers of composite armor that exploded when struck, deflecting any oncoming missile. The APS deployed hard-kill defensive measures, such as systems that could attack incoming missiles and even actual tank rounds, and soft-kill processes that could disrupt, confuse, and deflect any incoming attack. Some analysts concluded that the Russian designers had based the tank's defensive measures on the highly effective modern Israeli tank, the Merkava. The manufacturer claimed that special radar-absorbing paint would render the T-14 more or less invisible. A T-15 infantry fighting vehicle variant was also spotted at the Victory Day Parade, and a photograph of a T-16 tank recovery version equipped with a bulldozer blade and an automated 12.7mm machine gun turret was issued by the manufacturers. Both variants seem to have the same armor defensive measures as the T-14. Western intelligence analysts were quick to express concern about the potential of this new vehicle system. The unmanned turret design would afford the vehicle a lighter, faster, lower profile. A leaked United Kingdom Ministry of Defense document showed very real worry about the capabilities of the T-14. In November 2016, the British Daily Telegraph newspaper carried some dramatic quotes from the assessment, calling it a groundbreaking tank and the most revolutionary step change in tank design in the last half-century. A stark question was posed: are we on the cusp of a new technological arms race? There was also grave concern that the West was not also developing any plans for a tank to rival the T-14. At the time, the British and Americans were focused on the challenges of counterinsurgency warfare in the mountains, waterways, and deserts of Afghanistan. The defense industry design and development effort was being directed toward high-mobility vehicles and the challenges of defeating improvised explosive devices. For the last 20 years, Britain had no significant need for a new fleet of main battle tanks. The 2016 Military Balance Report from the International Institute for Strategic Studies similarly described the T-14 as, quote, revolutionary, highlighting the tank's active protection systems as something that would greatly reduce the risk from rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank guided missiles. After the initial announcements and revelations of the new T-14 concept, there was an analytical backlash. In the absence of any verifiable evidence, Western analysts gradually adopted a more skeptical view of the T-14. U.S. analysis in 2015 was already pointing out that there had been no independent verification or public demonstrations of the claims and capabilities attributed to the T-14, particularly how effective the defense systems would be. The American National Interest Journal, in late 2016, observed that U.S. analysts felt that the capability claims of the T-14 were greatly exaggerated. The practicalities of producing a new high-tech tank were pointed out, starting with the fact that Russia simply did not have the money and resources to produce the tank in any significant numbers. Well, the claims for the T-14 were certainly impressive. However, a famous British football manager once dryly observed, "We had a great team on paper. Unfortunately, the match was played on grass." So now, having heard the hype, let's step back a bit and review some of the practical problems that the T-14 might have, as its manufacturers attempt to move it from a theoretical drawing concept to an actual working battlefield-dominating weapon. The production schedule and cryptic messages from the Russian government and industry pointed to some of these problems. The Russian Ministry of Defense declared in 2016 that a batch of 100 T-14 tanks would be manufactured by 2020 as part of a project that would go on until 2025. But this served to set the scene for confused announcements, contradictions, and delays to this original timeframe. In 2018, the Deputy Prime Minister for the Defense and Space Industry reportedly said that there was actually no need for a new main battle tank system, as the Russian army had more than enough of the older tanks, the various modified variants of the T-72 in particular, to suffice. This argument held that the existing vehicles were still effective as tank platforms, and they would be cheaper and more practical to simply continue on with them, upgrading them with offensive and defensive measures as appropriate. This was probably a better and more realistic reflection of the harsh realities facing the Russian arms industry, but it also gave some indication of the doubts already surrounding the long-term prospects for the T-14. Finances were strained and access to high-tech computer technology was hard, given the sanctions imposed on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. But it went in the direct contradiction of the defense industry in other parts of the government. The month after this statement came out, it was reported that a contract had been signed for 32 T-14 tanks and 100 T-15 infantry fighting vehicles. By early February 2019, the first dozen tanks were supposed to have been built, but nothing had happened, and a subsequent announcement in August said that 16 would not be delivered until the end of the year. In November, the deadline had slipped further into early 2020. When 2020 rolled around, there was absolutely no evidence that anything like 100 tanks had been produced, even though there was still talk of state trials taking place and even bolder talk about unmanned versions of the T-14. But in January, the head of Rostec, Russia's largest state-owned arms company, stated that no T-14s had yet been produced and that the engine design had not yet been finalized. In August 2020, it was announced that production had started and that the tank would be given to the armed forces in 2021. But as the years drifted by, these announcements were looking less and less convincing. Another statement in July 2021 said that production would begin in 2022. However, the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu had already slightly undermined this in March, when he said the first group to be produced would only be for experimental purposes. The gap between reality and actuality continued to stretch, with announcements in December 2021 that the ammunition loader for the main armament was being trialed in 2022, and that full serial production would take place, and that 40 T-14s would be delivered after 2023. In the summer of 2022, the Russian army was several months into its invasion of Ukraine. The invasion was not going well. The war in Ukraine exposed many vulnerabilities of the Russian tank fleet. YouTube was awash with dozens of spectacular examples of tanks erupting in brilliant orange balls of flame, with the turrets hurtling skyward. This showed, amongst other things, that the automatic loading concept for the main armament were flawed. Shells were not being adequately protected inside the turret, with disastrous consequences. The tank designers scrambled to identify what lessons the current conflict might reveal for the T-14. The defensive measures attributed to the T-14 seemed designed to protect all sides, but not from above, which is becoming a favorite angle of attack for drones. Based on early experiences of Russian armor in Ukraine, ideas for modifications for the T-14 were drafted to extend the range of the active protection system, to offer more protection against rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank guided missiles, and to add better defense against electromagnetic and microwave weapons. In addition, it became clear that minefields were still popular with both sides, requiring new ways of remotely dealing with this threat. This would point to more delays to production. A weapon system that can prove itself effective and reliable on the battlefield can make it a highly attractive sales option for other countries. The Russians have claimed that both the Indians and the Chinese had expressed interest, and perhaps Egypt and Belarus. But it's one thing to be interested, quite another to step up with a multi-million ruble contract. Norinco, China's state-owned defense corporation, has claimed that their own tank, the VT-4, is superior to the T-14. So, here's the big question. Given that the T-14 has been evident at victory parades since 2015, is there any evidence that it's been tested in combat operations? Nearly a decade on. Well, as of today, there's no credible evidence that the T-14 has any real combat experience to point to. Curiously, in 2020, Russian government sources floated the idea that the T-14 had been tested in Syria. This seems highly unlikely even if we remembered that, quote, tested doesn't necessarily mean, quote, combat tested. But the big question mark now is whether the T-14 has seen any service in Ukraine. For propaganda purposes and perhaps even more importantly, achieving the full overseas sales potential, it would be ideal for the Russian army to be able to point to T-14 tanks advancing across the Ukraine steppe, engaging and defeating the Western tanks, such as the German Leopard 2 and the American Abrams, with which the Ukrainian army is being equipped. A photograph of a T-14 posing next to the shattered hull of a decadent Western main battle tank would be the icing on the cake for President Putin. But so far, we've seen very little credible evidence of any T-14s in Ukraine in a serious combat role. Is it reasonable to expect that social media networks, open-source intelligence, and drones would surely have picked up pictures of the T-14 in action by now? The Ukrainians would have reported engaging something as distinctive and interesting as a T-14. Surely. In December 2022, Russian television showed clips of the T-14 undergoing what was described as combat training, and with the commentary that the tank had already been deployed to the combat zone. The size and nature of the combat zone was never clear, nor even if the tank was actually in Ukraine at all. The state-owned Russian press agency Novosti reported in late April 2023 that the T-14 had been used in an indirect fire role against Ukrainian positions. This implies the tank had been lined up behind a hill, forest, or built-up area, out of sight of the enemy and used as a form of artillery. This is not exactly the type of tactic envisaged for a frontline main battle tank. If this reporting is accurate, it suggests the Russians feel their T-14 is not yet ready for a full test in combat, or they're worried it might break down and get captured, or they're simply trying to score a propaganda victory, or all of the above. On the 9th of May 2023, no T-14 tanks appeared at the World War II victory parade. In July 2023, the Russian state-owned news agency TASS briefly noted that the T-14 was being used by Russian forces in southern Ukraine to test and assess the tank's performance. In any case, by the end of August 2023, the Ukrainians had never reported meeting it in battle, and on September 4th, the Russian press reported that the T-14 had been withdrawn from Ukraine. Perhaps the manufacturers simply wanted an "as used in Ukraine" tag and a photo opportunity for the marketing brochure. But interestingly, the report also stated that additional side armor protection had been added to the tank to guard against anti-tank strikes. Clearly, the conflict in Ukraine has been throwing up fundamental development challenges, not least from drones, anti-tank missiles, and long-range artillery for all tanks in armored warfare. And let's just pause a moment. There are many other factors that impact a tank's effectiveness on the battlefield beyond merely the size of the gun and the thickness of the armor. Morale, motivation, and training are crucial. Tactical doctrine decides how best a tank should be used. Cooperation with artillery, infantry, and air power is also vital. Having a three-man crew does offer much spare capacity for routine maintenance, cooking food, mounting sentry duty, and a host of other routine but tiring tasks in a combat zone. The Russian logistics system is in tatters, reliant on men to lug ammunition around rather than automated loading systems with pallets and machines to take the strain. You could have the best tank in the world on paper, but still see it abandoned because the crew is unwilling to move into the assault, or the tank has shed a track, or because they simply have run out of fuel. But still, the myths and hype persisted. In some elements of the Russian media, there was still seemingly misplaced confidence that the T-14 would be a world beater. An August 2022 article breathlessly reported that by 2030, the T-14 would be so advanced that the crew would be operating their own reconnaissance drones, deploy a 152mm gun, a caliber which, let's not forget, is normally the stuff of heavy artillery, fire thermobaric fuel-air explosives and supersonic rounds, shoot fire-and-forget missiles, and be able to identify enemy targets at ranges of over 6 kilometers. When large-scale Russian land, sea, and air forces plunged into Ukraine in 2022, suddenly the world was witnessing a large-scale conflict that involved major tank actions. The Russian army suffered and continues to suffer extremely high losses to its tank, artillery, airborne, and infantry forces. Numbers of casualties of men and equipment losses remain hard to pin down, but there is a lot of credible reporting to suggest that Russia has lost 250,000 men and between 3,000 to 5,000 armored vehicles. Many analysts were shocked by the scale of Russian tank losses and the ease with which they catastrophically exploded when struck. Some analysts went as far as to predict that the tank was now an obsolete weapon of war and that drones and missiles would now rule the battlefield. This analysis is probably premature, but the rapid evolution of anti-tank technology in Ukraine is causing much pause for thought in terms of tank design. It's likely that Russian tank designers, just like their Western counterparts, will be taking a wholesale head-scratching review of just what it means to be a tank on the battlefields of the 2030s and 2040s. But Russia, still embedded deep in this brutal conflict inside Ukraine, desperately needs tanks now, and not 10 years in the future. They've reportedly lost between 1,500 and 2,000 tanks in battle. They have no significant manufacturing capability to crank out the current tank types, let alone build, test, and mass-produce serious numbers of a brand new, unproven, and technologically complex piece of equipment. Each of the T-14 tanks to date have been lovingly handmade. There's no factory production line standing by ready to roll out fresh, new, modern armor in the way that the Stalingrad tank works in 1942 were able to churn out T-34 tanks and drive them directly to the front line. And sanctions are greatly impeding the ability of defense manufacturers to access the high-quality, complex electronics that are primarily available in the West. In one crazy example from October 2022, the Swedish press began reporting the mysterious disappearance of traffic speed cameras all over the country. Crucial parts of the cameras were then smuggled into Russia, where the electronic parts could be cannibalized for Russian drones. We shouldn't write off the T-14 entirely just yet. The apparent failure is probably the best word here, of the T-14 development and procurement process could be used as a lesson for the Russian designers. Perhaps the T-14 or aspects of its design might end up as a technology demonstrator for new ideas further downstream, but the current realities make it highly unlikely that the Russian tank industry, suffering from corruption, lack of resources, and limited finances, will be able to conceive, design, and mass-produce a new tank system anytime soon. They'll probably have to stick with updates to older models, the T-72 and T-90 types. The T-90M is probably the most modern Russian tank on the battlefield at present. These upgrades are expensive and difficult enough, and the rapidly changing battlefield environment will make this even more complicated. And who knows, perhaps in 10 years or so, in 2034, a new Russian tank system successor to the T-14 will find itself acquiring the legendary designator of T-34. While it's certainly possible, but think of it this way. With all the long-term flaws in the Russian government and procurement system, corruption, lack of funds, lack of assembly lines, technology sanctions, and so on, perhaps this new T-34 might turn out to be a real turkey. Oh, but you're welcome to buy the T-14 yourself at 1/35th scale, paints and brushes included. At least the plastic production lines seem to be working. But what do you think? In what way is the T-14 radical or ridiculous? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.